Hi, everyone, and welcome to Underreporting of Suicide Attempts by Gender Non-Conforming Individuals. For several years during the month of July, Mental Health America has created campaigns to bring awareness to the unique struggles that underrepresented groups face in regard to mental illness in the United States. Our efforts aim to extend and honor the work of Phoebe Moore Campbell, a mental health advocate, author, and speaker. In June 2008, July was officially recognized by Congress as Phoebe Moore Campbell National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. As we continue to honor her work, we also recognize that people and language evolve. So MHA has chosen to remove the word minority from our materials. Instead, we are using a different designation, BIPOC, that we believe more fairly honors and distinguishes experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Moving forward, MHA will refer to our efforts in July as centered around BIPOC Mental Health Month. If you want to learn more about BIPOC mental health or Phoebe Moore Campbell, please visit mhanational.org/BIPOC. Today's speaker is Sam Brinton, who will be discussing underreporting of suicide attempts in gender nonconforming individuals. As a reminder, we do not offer CEUs, but will provide information at the end regarding how to receive a certificate of attendance. Today's webinar will be recorded with both the recording and slides posted online within 5 business days. All attendees will be sent an email once these materials are posted. Sam Brinton is one of the world's leading advocates for LGBTQ youth. They are the founder of the 50 Bill 50 States campaign at the Trevor Project to end the dangerous and discredited practice of conversion therapy, first in the United States and then around the globe. As a survivor of conversion therapy, Sam has spoken before the United Nations and Congress, as well as testified on legislation from coast to coast to protect LGBTQ youth across the country. They've been featured in numerous media, including a recent New York Times op-ed, as well as the Washington Post, Playboy magazine, and Time magazine. Sam uses they, them, or theirs as their pronoun as a gender fluid person. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Sam.
Thanks so much, my friend. Hello, everyone. It is so great to be here with each and every one of you today. This is the definition of a pivotal issue where so little is known and yet so much impact can be brought about by simple action. So I'm really excited to be here with you today and to make sure that we have a very fluid, open conversation around the work being done to better collect information when it comes to suicides and violent deaths related to my community, the non-binary, gender fluid, gender non-conforming, lots of different terms, but all similar passions for work of our identities. So let's get started, shall we? First off, let's see if this slide goes. Great. Okay, so first off, a little bit about the organization that I work with. Just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the Trevor Project was founded more than 20 years ago with the express goal of making sure that LGBTQ youth know that they had someone they could call, someone they could talk to, someone who would be there for them if they were ever feeling lost and alone. We were founded after the amazing work of our a short video about 20 years ago. Ellen DeGeneres had just come out, introduced the video, and our founders recognized that we need to have someone for people to call if the movie, right, this short film actually moved them to want to come out or want to talk to someone about their troubles. And so the Trevor Project was founded. Now we're, moving into the modern age. I'm really excited to say that as a millennial myself, who can't stand to talk on the phone or remember all the numbers, we have easy to access text and chat abilities. So we're so excited to always partner with MHA, but if you ever have a young LGBTQ young person in your life, or you may not know it, so you should always just be sharing these resources, I want you to know that whether it's through the phone line, the text, the chat line, or even our social media peer-to-peer conversations via Trevor Space, there's always a place for you in this conversation to do good work as it relates to saving young LGBTQ lives. We say we do this through 4 letters. You know, we hear LGBTQ youth in crisis. First, we help. First is we are there as the lifeline. Second, we educate. Just like we're doing right now, we are able to work on a variety of different education, whether that be, you know, every school teacher in the city of New York, or working with hospitals to make sure that they are providing the best type of care to trans and non-binary youth. Doing work within not only our schools and hospitals, right, but among our churches, making sure that faith communities have a place to go about this. I want to make sure you know that we're here to educate in that work. We're also here to advocate. That's my role. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy and Government Affairs for the Trevor Project. My job is, whether it be the state legislature, the federal legislature, or any other program, it's really important for us to advocate for the rights and responsibilities of LGBTQ youth. And you are going to see the ability for us to kind of, I would say, advocate in this specific issue as well. Also, we do research. Yay, data, nerds! A little bit about my background, just so you know who in the world is talking to you. My name is Sam Brinton. As was mentioned, I do use they and them as my pronouns. But I am a graduate of MIT with graduate degrees in nuclear engineering and technology policy. So my background, before I worked in mental health policy, was I disarmed nuclear bombs and managed programs and systems around nuclear waste. You may be like, what? This was where I got my passion for data. Knowing how to solve the problem starts with knowing what the problem is. And that is why our research team is so important. We've collaborated with MHA and others on this really important work to make sure LGBTQ youth, their experiences, their struggles, and their successes are all being raised up in their own voice via this type of large national surveys. So that's enough about Trevor Project, but I want to make sure you kind of had a level setting moment of just why we're here today. So let's go to the next one. The slide after this should go. Perfect, is on background. I wanted to make sure that we started with a little bit of, again, our initial data. So we have estimated that 1.8 million LGBTQ youth in crisis every year need service, need help, need someone to let them know that they are not alone. This is compounded by the fact that LGBTQ youth are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their straight or cisgender peers. It's really critical that we recognize that not all risks are created equal. I'm so glad that MHA is changing the language from minority to BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, mental health month, right? Because this is about making sure that we're using the best language and recognizing that the needs of our communities have to be specific. They have to be direct. We need to call out different minority needs so that they can be best served. That's actually the whole reason we're here today, right? We're about to learn that there's almost no data when it comes to gender nonconforming suicide. And so it kind of leads us to, well, without data, what do we do, right? So first off, you need to know 1.8 million youth are in crisis, LGBTQ youth, are in crisis every year. Second, you need to know that those youth are at higher risk than, for example, straight or cisgender youth. I'm not going to go through all of the terms that I'm going to use today, for example, of straight and cisgender and transgender. Definitions are, by their very nature, fluid and change a lot. So if you have questions at the end, super excited to take those questions and help do my best with the definitions that I use, or Google is your friend. Awesome. Okay, so 1.8 million at risk. 4 to 5 times as likely to attempt suicide than the straight and cisgender peers. But the problem is that we know attempt rates. We do not know how many LGBTQ youth die by suicide. This is because we have no systematic data collection when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity. So this is really making it complex to do all this work. It's going to be a really weird session because I'm basically going to tell you how much we don't know. which is a really annoying part of, I'm sure, a session that you're like, well, I want to know how. I promise you we have good ideas of how to do some of this work, but it's not actually a good starting place. We're not coming from a place of power right now. Okay, first off, I want to make sure to bring in some of the latest and greatest, the latest data on trans and non-binary youth. To anyone asking, I just want to make sure you know, you will be able to get a copy of the PowerPoint. So in the case that's coming through. So there's a lot of numbers. I'm going to do my best to keep you engaged despite all of the numbers. So first off, a really, really sad number. Half, according to our 2020 survey of more than 40,000 LGBTQ youth, again, one of the largest national surveys ever on LGBTQ mental health, more than half of transgender and non-binary youth have seriously considered suicide. Again, I will repeat that. More than half of trans and non-binary youth have seriously considered suicide. That rate is significantly higher than those of their straight and cisgender peers, and it's really a lot of work to be done to make sure that we can get that number down to zero. We should want to, work Sam out of a job, make it so that LGBTQ youth suicide is a thing of the past, but we are far from that today, my friends. It's really important to note that if you are supportive of a trans and non-binary person, so if you use the proper pronouns, notice that the very first thing I said when I started this presentation was, my name is Sam Brinton, right? And I use they and them as my pronouns. I was giving this to you as a hint, right? Please use these as my pronouns so that way I don't have to, be thinking, does this person respect me for who I am? We know that only 1 in 5 trans and non-binary youth reported having their pronouns respected by all or most of the people in their lives. 1 in 5. Could you imagine, and I'll just keep going and then I'll give us an example, including 1 in 10 among those who are primarily identified as non-binary. Now, non-binary people use a lot of different pronouns. I identify as non-binary in that I identify as a subset called gender fluid, and I use they and them as my pronouns. Could you imagine if I instead told you, hi, my name is Sam Brinton, and I would like you to, call me Sam, right? It's an integral part of who I am. I've given you this knowledge, right? Not Samuel, not Sammy, Sam. That's what I would like to be called. If only 1 in 10 of you used my name, Sam, and the other 9 called me Sammy, Samantha, Samuel, Serengeti, right? Like they just started calling me different things. How am I supposed to believe that you listened to me or you supported me, you support, me getting through the day? I won't respond necessarily to Serengeti or Samantha because that's not the pronouns or the name that I've asked you to use, right? So I think it's really important for us to say, we're giving the hint, like whether it be a name badge or by verbal cues of what our pronouns are, that's really important to be supporting us because it's already pretty evident that we're not getting that support. That's why more than half of trans and non-binary youth have seriously considered suicide. So I want to make sure we started with what we do know. This is the Trevor Project 2020 survey. So what did we do to learn more? There's a thing called the National Violent Death Reporting System, the NVDRS. And I'm going to call it NVDRS because I don't want to keep calling it the whole name, right? So the NVDRS is where data around violent death, aka suicide, homicide, or investigated deaths, for example, like opioid deaths, are all collected. They're put into one place under a death investigation. They're called medical legal investigations around death or mortality data. So we reached out to, at the time, 42 NVDRS states. Now all 50 have started. Yay! We're actually getting a national sample, finally. And we reached out to the coordinators of those different national violent death reporting systems in each state. That comes up to the main system, the national numbers, right? There are a couple of ways that you can get data when it comes to National Violent Death Reporting System and sexual orientation and gender identity. The first is a person's sex, male, female, and unknown. Sometimes a person will put unknown for if they don't know if the person is male or female. For example, this could be an intersex person. This could be a person who is transgender. It could be a lot of different things. But without training, there's just sometimes people are classified as unknown. Second is there is an actual question in the National Violent Death Reporting System that says, is this person transgender? That's a big deal. In a national survey to have that kind of level, really important. The problem is that without much information behind it, you're kind of guessing if this person is transgender or not. And last but not least, we did, of course, ask about sexual orientation. In the sexual orientation question around National Violent Death Reporting System, and NVDRS, we have straight, homosexual, and bisexual, right? Gay and lesbian being broken out of the homosexual spaces. That's a very limited population, but at least it's some data. So we know that LGBTQ youth are at risk and trans youth are at specific risk. We know that the National Violent Death Reporting System is supposed to be collecting this kind of information. So let's hope that we found some data, right? Wrong, so wrong. So first off, a lot of people didn't even respond, did not even respond to us. Then 55% of the states that did provide any response at all, right? So 45%, no response at all. Just like did not reply to us, crickets. And this is with CDC support, right? Like just nothing. 55%, when we asked about these questions about sexual orientation and gender identity, gave us some type of response. That's great. Only 33%, so 1 in 3, reported a single LGBT death since 2013. So my joke there, and this is a joke to be very clear, is that LGBT people are clearly living forever. Because if only 1/3 of the states are recording a single death, we're pretty great, my friends. Like, woohoo, immortality, not reality, right? This is not a thing. And so trying to make sure that we actually get some good data, 16% didn't even have the correct contact information, and only 12%, 5 states, which I guess would be more like 50. Well, this was 42, so that's why it is 12%. Reported more than 50 LGBT deaths. There is definitely likely at least 50 deaths in the last, like 7 to 8 years when it comes to violent deaths. That's just it on a basic statistics of 3 to 5% of the population being LGBTQ, you should have 3 to 5% of the violent deaths at least be LGBTQ, and significantly below that number is still being reported. 5 states. In 5 states is all that we are possibly doing good data on. Now, this is going to be the most data-heavy slide I've got, and I'm really sorry to say that because you now see we just don't have numbers. If 5 states are getting somewhat good data, 33% are reporting a single death in the time that this is being collected, and 45% are not 45% are not even responding. We have a big problem of priority. I did want to give a good example, right? I'm a Pollyanna. I like the good things in the world. So I did want us to talk a little bit about a good moment. So we know that Colorado has 64 county coroners and over 200 law enforcement agencies. These are all the different little projects, right? We worked with an organization called American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and Maggie Mortali at that with AFSP did a great training for the Colorado Coroners Association. They also did a creation of an improved suicide investigation form. So when you're a death investigator, you have a form that you fill out of the name, the sex, the veteran status, the height, weight, things you see around at the crime scene. Like all of this is getting into a big investigation form. But sexual orientation and gender identity weren't included, but they are now with this new program. And that made a difference. When we had training and when they improved it onto the form, Colorado has reported 79 suicides under sexual orientation. again, that omits transgender. So the whole purpose of this session is the non-binary community, right? Omitted in Colorado, but it's the closest to good data I've got, right? And it's still a significant undercount. But because of the training and because of the ability to ask the questions, we were able to actually get closer to good data. So now we know the solution. Do some training, add it to the form, and you will get closer to appropriate. When that happened, we were able to pass laws. For example, in Colorado, we were recently able to pass one of my life's work efforts, which is end of work to end conversion therapy. The work to end conversion therapy is somewhat derived by the idea of conversion therapy causes significant mental harm and mental trauma. And with the ability to say, we have seen a rise in suicides of LGBTQ people in Colorado, some of them reporting that they are survivors of conversion therapy, we're able to say, this is a reason to stop conversion therapy. We shouldn't have to, but this is really supposed to be about making sure that we are saying, this data has to be collected. It's not being collected, right? But the little minute data that we do have is really, really important. So a good way to talk about this. So I did want us to make sure that we also got a little bit of the numbers. So this is specifics from Colorado. So you can see that the number is very low, right? 24, 22, and 23 are 2% of the population of suicides identifying as LGBTQ. That's close to 3 to 5%. So we will consider that a quote unquote win. We don't want anyone, obviously, to die by suicide. Let's be very, 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 very clear. We would like that number to always be 0 across the board. But as you can see, it is a percentage closer to the average amount of LGBTQ people, and that's a really encouraging sign. So again, these slides will be available, but I wanted to make sure that you noticed this kind of work. For example, in Los Angeles, they also have roughly about 900 suicides per year. And we have now been able to pass an ordinance in Los Angeles where every single death investigation will ask questions around sexual orientation or gender identity. This is a big win. It's a way for us to make sure that every single person who has a violent death in Los Angeles is going to get a little bit closer to getting good data so that we can have good policies. It's important to recognize that it all comes back to this undercounting, the whole title, right? The undercounting of non-binary and gender non-conforming people means that policies related to our mental health and our mortality are unable to, be able to progress as quickly because we don't have the numbers. So just wanted to connect that back. Let's see if this moves. There we go. Okay, so I wanted to offer some concluding thoughts and then let's get into some questions, shall we? So if you're in the I have so many questions, I get it. Sam did not present perfectly, lots of work to do, but I'm happy to have gotten the conversation started. And again, thank you so much, MHA, for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation with all of you. And with more of you than I've gotten to talk about this topic for a very long time. So first off, bad problem. There is no routine and systematic collection of this mortality data as it relates to sexual orientation, but especially gender identity. Even in the transgender question, it does not ask about gender nonconforming or non-binary people. It just says, is this person transgender? Some people who are transgender identify as non-binary, and some people who identify as non-binary do not identify as transgender. And so we have to recognize that specifics matter. Giving a place for the many of us who are having X on our driver's license and non-binary representation on our birth certificates is a way of us to start to say, you know what, this data needs to be collected so we can do good work. But it can get better. It can get better because there is training available. The Trevor Project is working on a systematic way of getting this training into the hands of every medical examiner, death investigator, and coroner across the country. We have to scale this up. In an age of COVID, when we know that it took some time to get training to be able to ask the right questions as it related to COVID and how COVID death was occurring, it's the same thing. We have the training available. We just have to get it into as many individuals as possible. And I look forward to working with each and every one of you to get those ordinances passed, to get the advocacy and the education and the research in front of our death investigators. I know not the most easy topic, but a topic that it could literally save, again, thousands upon thousands of lives by actually providing the best data and the best policy. We want the people on the ground to be able to collect this data comprehensively. It should not just be, this person looks different to me. Now I'll ask questions around transgender identity. No, ask the questions around sexual orientation and gender identity every single time. It is sometimes difficult. We don't get to make the decision around race about a person just willy-nilly, right? In the month of BIPOC mental health, right? It is important to recognize that some of these are self-identities, right? These are people who their families and friends will be able to help put together the picture of how to actually do this work. And your work matters. You will be able to get this kind of done. We have the sample ordinance ready for you to go. I'll give you my contact information here soon. I would love to get 100 emails from you of, let's do this in my city, because we have the ability to do it. It's just no one is talking about it. This is one of the only sessions on this topic that I have ever gotten to give. There's so rare conversation. So again, huge thank you for being part of it. Okay, so we've talked about our concluding thoughts. I want to give the way to get a hold of me is this email address. So Sam Brinton at thetrevorproject.org. If you want to learn more about the Trevor Project in general, you can go to www.thetrevorproject.org. And I am super excited to ask some time for questions. I'm going to leave this slide up for right now, so that way people can get my email address. But Maddie, I'll turn it over to you to start, hopefully, a really big series of questions to get this conversation moving forward. Thank you again to everybody for the time that you spent on this on a Friday afternoon.
Thank you so much for the very informative presentation, Sam. The one question that we're getting is if you would be able to share a sample of a suicide investigation form.
Absolutely. So we have a best practice of like how all the things could be added, and we also can get you a specific example that's being used in the field. So both the best practice and the one in the field. I'll write that down right now to make sure I have that available. Yep.
We got another question from somebody asking if some of these SOGI deaths were being intentionally misreported by states or municipalities that don't want this information available, possibly because they're worried that somebody might use it to profile them in a negative way, or partially because they have some otherwise nefarious agenda?
Yeah. It's a really important question, and thank you for asking it. When we talk to death investigators, one of the major concerns that we always get back is, this is such an uncomfortable question to ask a family or friend, right? Like, I wouldn't want someone to ask if my, partner was transgender. And we have to start with the realization that, like, there's a lot of questions asked in these suicide investigation forms that aren't comfortable. But who you love and how you identify with your gender identity is not the most uncomfortable question. We're asking about a variety of different topics. This is a suicide. It's an emotional time. And it cannot just be here's a, microphone in your face, was your kid gay? That's not gonna be helpful, right? But there's ways to go about asking these questions that are respectful and get the data. Second, it was also asked, like, what if it's being hidden on a quote unquote more systemic system? A systemic system. A systemic, problem. I would say that the best way that I can respond to that is actually, I know it's happening in reverse of that. So Utah, for example, is collecting this information in a really, sexual orientation and gender identity is collected in a really important and systematic way. And that's a state that many people might consider, not really supportive or not really, behind the LGBTQ community. But that's not necessarily true, right? Like, they want the data because they want to save lives. No matter who you are, no matter what you believe about LGBT equality, you do not want your community members to be dying. And this is a way to help make that stop. Does that answer the question, Maddie? And I just want to make sure if I didn't, I want to get back into it. So let me know.
Yeah, I given the phrasing of their question, I think that probably did a pretty good job of answering it.
Great.
The next question we got was, for the 5 states that were able to report good data for you, were you able to find any patterns in why they were able to collect such good data compared to the other states that had the immortals?
Absolutely. Good question. So the main answer is training. The states where it is best collected are the states where the training has occurred. So it's just like a pretty direct correlation there, right? Colorado, Nevada, Utah, places where the work has been done to train death investigators, the data is better. We do not know how long that training, like, quote unquote, lasts, right? Like, how long until you stop asking the question. We would hope that you don't stop asking the question, but that's something that we're gonna have to keep doing research on. Other states where it wasn't training were states where you had a large enough population that it kept coming up, for example, right? Now, that's not to say that it's actually happening, you know, systemically in what I would call LGBT hotspots, right? Like New York City, not well collecting this information. LA, until now, not well collecting this information. So it's kind of like the balancing act of states that had the training in their state did well. And states that made it a priority because of, for example, a lot of LGBTQ youth suicides, or something had happened systemically that there was enough of a reason to, in their minds, to make this a priority, aka the news had been talking about it, or there had been, for example, back a few summers ago, there was a lot of LGBTQ youth dying by suicide in the same summer. That some of the times that if there was a lot in that state, that's something that the state then made it a priority. So those are the two big things. What did we actually see in terms of like numbers and like data of those deaths? No, because it's still so sporadic that it's not, I would not trust that data as what I would call representative. I hope that answers that question for the person. I wish I could answer more. We're trying to do better and do some digging into. We're working with the CDC and the National Violent Death Reporting System at the Trevor Project to kind of dive into the states that are doing well and try to make some, you know, review, but it's hard because, again, this is so few numbers because it's not being well collected.
Another question was how to get around the issue of using Jane Doe, John Doe, unknown identity situations where maybe you have a death that appears to be a suicide, but there's no idea of the body, nobody's come and cleaned them.
That's fascinating. I have never been asked that question. Oh gosh, I love MHA so much. Okay, y'all are the best. I love it when I get something new to think about. Okay, so this is off the top of my head, so just know that this is coming from a place of Sam, not Trevor Project, because I have not been approved for this language. Jane Doe and John Doe. Great question. Is there a reason that you couldn't just call it J Doe? So one of the major things that non-binary individuals will use sometimes is they will just use an initial, right? We will just be S or TJ or RJ or whatever. I'm not going to go through a lot of acronyms, right? But like they'll go to an initial. So is there a reason you actually need Jane or John Doe? Couldn't you just say J Doe? That would solve this problem of potential answer. That was off the top of my head. I'm hoping that worked well. So anyway, that was a brilliant question, and I cannot wait to write an op-ed about how we should move everything to J Doe. And you heard it here first from me. It's probably like a really common idea that I just didn't know. So anyway, hopefully that was really helpful.
Somebody wanted to know what work is being done to get good denominators for mortality rates. And I'm going to add, since I know a little bit about this, that
Okay.
I know Griffith at least has started adding a question about both gender identity and sexual orientation, at least in the youth survey. I don't know if they're doing it in the larger survey. So do we have good national data?
Okay, so I'm gonna have to ask a clarify. So we don't have, you're talking about national data of attempts?
No, I think the person was asking in terms of sexual orientation, gender identity, like if we have genomic.
Oh, like just national numbers when it comes to what is the 3 to 5%? Like, how do we get that?
Yeah, and I think they were hoping to know how we were determining the number of deaths per 100,000.
Ooh, okay, so that's a really complex question. So first off is, if you want to know more about data collection as it relates to sexual orientation and gender identity, the best people, without question, is the Williams Institute. They're based at UCLA, and they are the ones who help us know what that percentage is in the different states. So it's just really important. If you have questions on that, I'm going to recommend go to Williams Institute. They're the ones who know how we get that that balance, right? Like how we get the different options, quote unquote, around it. Now they're very simple. Remember that any national surveys around this is not adding a lot of specificity. It's adding as little as possible to try to get as many answers as possible. That's a major challenge with the non-binary community, right? We use so many different terms, especially younger, that it's hard to kind of, I would say, lump them together, but better language is probably collect them together, right? So just know that that is not being, to my knowledge, there's not a really good national statistic around the number of around non-binary people in the United States. That's just a really hard number. The National Center for Transgender Equality has also put out a survey about the trans experience. That would be another area that you, again, it's huge, tens of thousands of people. So you can, again, kind of get it, but it's not population based, right? So it's not a connection out to the whole population. I think the question kind of centers around the idea, do we even know if people are dying, LGBT people are dying in some of these locations? Yes, because the LGBTQ population, through some of these Williams Institute surveys, the census, through same-sex partners on the census, right? Like, we know of LGBTQ people, we exist, hashtag we exist, right? But we do not have any commensurate data around how many of us are dying, violent deaths, specifically suicide. So that wasn't a great answer. I totally respect that, but that's as close as I can probably get to the answer. But I appreciate it, and I'm gonna write it down and hopefully have a better answer in the future, and I appreciate the push.
And do you have any racial or ethnic background breakouts of the statistics that you do have available?
So you're asking about the racial breakdown of basically those 5 states, right? That's all we have, right?
Right.
We have those 5 states. Yes, and I don't know it off of the top of my head, but I do know that it is very much skewed toward white individuals, because many times when it is a person of color, things are left as unknown. That's the top line I can talk to about it. I cannot give specifics because some of the percentages are so off, right? Again, I don't trust any of this data. So this underreporting is bad, but it is more underreporting with people of color than with white people. Does that make sense? Did my answer make sense?
I think it makes sense.
Great.
I hope everyone else does as well.
Well, again, if they all comment that this was the worst presentation ever, you can just never invite me back.
So one person wanted to know about, in California, they tried to pass a bill that would require SOGI data reporting for all violent deaths, but the bill died due to cost. And if you could talk about what the actual costs are of this, if there's a lot of upfront costs versus if it's a lot more cost and sustainment, and what we should realistically expect the health departments to do, in part because they are so cash strapped at the moment dealing with a pandemic.
Y'all are the best, seriously. I want to always, always, always come back to y'all. This is so spectacular. Okay, so I didn't think people would know about AB 650, so I didn't go into super depth. I had a whole slide about it that I now should have included. Okay, so AB 650 is this legislation that was built in California. To just be super frank, I wrote it, right? Like it was one of the original bills. It is the original bill on sexual orientation and gender identity data collection when it gets to on a state level. It was huge, revolutionary in that it started the conversation. It got derailed, yes, because of cost. Trying to educate every medical examiner, death investigator in a state can be somewhat difficult. That's why we moved back down to LA. LA County was able to do it because the Board of Supervisors said, this is a priority. We want to make sure that this is something that we are collecting so we can put the resources to where they need to be done. You're asked a little bit about cost. The training is pretty simple, and we're hoping to make this training more available to more individuals for less money. That is our goal at the Trevor Project. But I think it's really important to recognize that that it's not free right now, right? It does cost money to train people and takes time. That is going to be difficult, especially in the age of COVID. Medical examiners, death investigators, and coroners are overworked and underpaid right now. They always have been, but this is the worst kind of time for them. So what we're going to need to be doing is making sure that we have to address the current problems that are being faced, COVID and the general potential deaths of despair that could follow COVID. I think it's really important to recognize that we need to be framing this as a way of, we cannot go into another global pandemic without data, without asking this question so that we can know what communities are addressed. I'm going to make a connection that is not direct, but I want you to understand why I think of it this way. We know that 1 in 4 COVID deaths are Black people, Black Americans. That is a really awful disparity that is being demonstrated specifically by the numbers of these deaths. Now, violent deaths are not the same as COVID deaths. To be very, very clear, I am not stating that they're the same, but I am saying that we know about the problem because we are collecting this information, and I want to make sure that we actually say to each other, right, like, this is a disparity. We can address this disparity by better data collection and then putting resources where they're needed. The same thing needs to happen when it comes to this work. AB 650, the California bill on this data collection, will need to be duplicated in other states. So if you are interested in doing this kind of work in your state, there's my email address. sam.brinton@thetrevorproject.org is the best way to get a hold of me, so that way I can work with you to make sure that every state starts to collect this data. I hope that answered that question well. And thank you for asking it. It's a really specific niche issue I didn't think people would go into in California, so I'm really grateful for the person who asked that question, knowing their background. Way to go.
There are a lot of iterations on the question of how do you approach people to ask them about their gender identity, sexual orientation. Some of them are asking more generally, some people are asking specifically in medical context, and how this should be tracked in EHR systems or in intake forms.
Okay, I want to be very clear that I won't have all of the best language here. I'm still learning. I want to make sure that we all know that and give it a little bit of grace as we're moving forward. So first off is, this question is generally better if asked in the kind of demographics section. So if we ask things about how do we, does this person ever serve in the military, right? That's a way to get demographic information in a pretty direct way. Sexual orientation is a little bit harder. For a lot of these, especially if I'm talking about LGBTQ youth, right? These are young individuals. They may not have had a, significant, quote unquote, and I put that in very big terms, relationship, right? Or at least not had a public relationship to their parents. If, for example, you're asking about sexual orientation, there can just be like the question about relationships, or who did this person spend a lot of time with, right? These are ways to start to set some of that up. You can ask that person maybe about, you can ask the family, right? And then you can go and interview that person. It's called a psychological autopsy. You can go and interview that person, and you may learn different information than the parents are willing to give. This may give you a little bit of a disparity. You may have the parents saying that they're straight and the friends all saying that they're LGBTQ. If you can figure out ways to raise this issue gently, that's helpful. And sometimes it's not going to be helpful. It's just going to be data that's collected. But again, it's not going maybe on a death certificate. It's not going in a public sphere. It's always anonymized. So when this data gets up, you're just trying to remember, you're trying to learn how to solve this death investigation. It's like a mystery, right? And you want all the information. So when people push back saying, why do you need to know if my child was transgender? You're trying to get across the point that there is a high-risk population of LGBTQ youth, specifically trans and non-binary youth, that more than half of them have seriously considered a suicide. It is not uncommon for us to ask questions like this because we want to make sure that we understand all the potential risk factors. There could be a lot of things at play, and sexual orientation and gender identity are never the only part. But it is important for us to have a conversation and get the full picture to make sure that we are providing your child with the best amount of investigation that we can do now that we've lost them. You are clear, you're consistent, you ask this question all the time so that it doesn't become a just, oh, well, they had a rainbow flag in this bedroom, now I'll ask the question. No, you ask the question every time because it normalizes it, and you're able to tell them, this is something that we ask to make sure that we know all the different potential parts of this person's important life. I hope that answers the question, recognizing that you don't need to get into the specifics of specific terms. You're trying to pull out from an individual who is grieving information about someone that they loved, both who they loved and how they identified. I hope that answers the question and gave you a small example of how I would do those types of questions. I am not a death investigator, however, I'm an advocate, and so there's a different space, but we do have a little bit of training. There's a whole booklet on training of how to ask these questions with, for example, scenarios that would give you the ability to do that kind of work. Thanks for asking.
So another question we got was about youth specifically, and
about what?
Youth specifically. Okay. And if the youth is not out to their family,
yep,
do they ask friends? Do they only ask parents for people under 18? What's the process with young adults specifically, or I guess children, more accurate?
Sure, it depends. Per usual, right? It depends. It does depend, right? It really depends on the death investigation, the amount of resources that they have, and the amount of time that they have to dedicate to this investigation. If a person has more time, many times they will speak to friends, right? So for example, if this is a suicide, to stop contagion and to make sure that others in the community are not facing the same problems, there may be conversations that happen with families and friends. That can be a way that non-family members can be involved. If the person is, for example, homeless, you may be going to next of kin, but you may also be going to those who are been interacting with them. LGBTQ youth, as you know, I believe it is 40%, so 2 out of 5. 40% of the homeless population that are youth identify as LGBTQ. So this would be another space where it wouldn't be the family member necessarily. It would also, although it would be potentially the family, it would also be the family and friends around it. I think that answers the question. So the question basically being, would you ask friends? Sometimes. We are encouraging that you obviously should do it as much as possible to get a full rounded picture, but we recognize resources are limited and that you may not have the time to do that level of investigation.
So another thing that people are asking about is if it's possible to ask this information of children and what, rights parents have in these cases.
Is it appropriate to ask a question about sexual orientation or gender identity of a child? And does the parent have the right to not want that question to be asked? I think is how I took that. Yes?
That's my understanding as well.
That's a good question. It's complicated. Not a lawyer, but this kind of information is never, quote unquote, this is all anonymized. So again, this isn't outing a child because this is getting data that is then sent into a death investigation. The death will be classified potentially as a suicide or not. But this type of demographic information is then anonymized and placed into the National Violent Death Reporting System through abstraction. So yes, a parent always has the right to refuse to respond to information, to request, right? Like, it is not a mandatory death investigation. Well, okay, it is mandatory to have a death investigation to be able to classify it, but you do not have to reply to any of the questions. So, for example, and this is not the same, but again, to make an example, the same questions around substance abuse are typically asked of parents. And parents will refuse to respond. How dare you think that my child would ever be doing drugs, right? Well, again, if you don't ask other community members, if you don't ask people around them, you may not be able to get this information. You may not be able to have a full picture. But they always have the right to refuse to answer. The questions, if they are part of the suicide investigation form, are so normalized that they become then kind of rote. And a person can refuse to answer them, but it still is there as a system of data collection. I hope that answered that well. It was a really important question about how to make sure that they are respected in a time of grieving, but also the investigation isn't hindered. I hope that answered. That wasn't probably my greatest, but I did my best.
Another demographics related question we got was if you saw differences in reporting between urban, suburban, and rural areas and the places where data wasn't collected.
Urban spaces have more deaths, therefore their data collection is more reliable. For example, there may be full, huge counties where there's a single coroner who is elected into the position, has no background in death investigation, and is still elected as the county coroner, for example. So the breakdown in general has been the closer you are to a city, the better your death investigation resources are, and thus the better your data is to be kind of comparatively compared. I hope that helps.
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions about how people can go about making sure that their communities are doing these trainings, what they can do to end a more advocacy related role, and what kind of funding would actually be required from them, from their local jurisdiction in order to get this off the ground.
Okay, so a couple of different options that you have. First is I would, again, be willing to work with every single one of you on a state level bill around this issue. Doing it on a state level will be able to give you better data because it's not jurisdictional. So if you're not within this county limits, right, you're not going to get counted. So generally best to start with a state. You have amazing chapters around the country. I would love, we have sample legislation that has been improved since AB 650 that we can share with you, and sam.brinton@thetrevorproject.org. Happy to work with you on state level legislation. Then, if that is not an opportunity right now, local. So if you live in a major city, or if you live in a small city, I don't care, right? Like, if you are willing to work on this issue, I would love if a city of 100 still has that their death investigations will include this data, because it shows that no matter where you live, LGBTQ people exist and that we deserve to be counted even in our death. That was so preachy, but so important, right? So if you want to work on a city level, we can build it off of the LA ordinance that we were able to pass. I would be happy to, sam.brinton@thetrevorproject.org, able to work with you to make sure that we get a local ordinance on this investigation. You asked about what the cost of the training can be. The cost of the training can literally be in the few thousands, right? Or we're trying to get it, even cheaper than that. But right now, I would say it is very, very non-cost prohibitive. It's just not asked for. So getting local death investigators to know that this is available is important. As soon as we ask if we ask death investigators, are you asking these questions? And as a survey, they've generally said no. When we say, if there's a training available, would you be willing to take that training? Nearly 100% say yes. So all you have to do is say, hey, Sam, I want to work in X city to do this type of death investigation. Let's get them trained, and I will work with you to make sure that happens. That was the city. and state and the cost, again, I would say, again, depending on the size, right? If you have 100 death investigators, that's going to be more training than just, 5. So that there's a difference there, right? And then last but not least, I would say it's raising attention. So for example, if you see a reporting about a LGBTQ suicide or homicide, posting about it can be triggering to some, but posting about it and saying that we don't actually know the whole number because we're not collecting the data is an important way to both honor a death that should never have happened in the first place, but is also saying let's prevent the future death by getting better data. So I hope those were a few different ways, whether that be advocacy, social media, or economic ways to address this. Maddie, was that helpful? And is there anything else that I can give you on that?
I think that was pretty comprehensive, and I think at the end of the day, a lot of these people are just going to have to reach out to you
Yes.
directly. And we can't possibly cover the nuances of each individual situation.
Yep. I'm ready. My email inbox is ready. I will answer all weekend. If you actually email me now, I will absolutely respond. And I promise you, we have a whole team dedicated to working on this issue. I'm excited to work with each and every one of you on it.
Someone wanted to know what kind of funding sources are available for people who want to work on SOGI suicide ideation and kind of what the landscape out there looks like. Like, where are you going to companies to get your money for this stuff? Are states getting it from a tax?
Good question. Remember that there's only one jurisdiction that has had to pass an ordinance. The other cities went through grants through like big foundations. So the not cities, they have the big states. So Nevada, Utah, Colorado, right, did a grant through foundations. That is all stopped. Right now, we're finding that cities should be able to, were pre-COVID able to handle the cost. This may not be the case anymore. And so, I mean, there is the possibility. We have recommended that either a state or the city put a small amount of, again, this is such a small amount of budget toward this issue, should be enough. How are we funded? It is completely coming out of our general funds through our donations as well. So it's just really important to recognize that Trevor Project is doing this work out of the goodness of our hearts because we think it's important to end LGBTQ youth suicide. We don't know how many LGBTQ young people are even dying of suicide. So how do I do my job well if I don't actually know the true magnitude of the problem? So that's where some of that funding comes from. CDC has not funded a lot into this, but does fund the National Violent Death Reporting System. NIH has not funded research on this recently. Otherwise, I think that's basically, so city, state, small amounts of funding are what has been successful in the past. And I think that they will be successful in the future because they're so tiny. They're not large scale costs. Hope that answers.
And then for one last question is all we have time for.
Sure.
It was whether or not you were seeing a lot of the reported suicides had substance use involved in some way or another, whether they were a substance user or they died from an overdose.
Thank you for asking. So of the 5 states, there was not enough information to make there was not enough information to make a justification in either direction. So either substance abuse being used a lot or not being used a lot. It was, again, very, I would call sporadic. We do know that substance abuse deaths are rising and some of them could be classified as suicides. So we are making sure that, for example, opioid-related deaths, which are significantly on the rise, nearly as many people died in LA County of opioid deaths as they did of suicide. That's not acceptable. And so we need to make sure, not because, again, I am not shaming substance abuse. I am saying that we need to have better data to do better policies. That is what I am being very clear about. So since those deaths are also on the rise, we are hoping that substance abuse related deaths should also sometimes have this information collected.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sam, for this incredibly informative presentation. For anyone who needs a certificate of attendance, please email mhalpern@mhanational.org, and I can help you with that. And if you have any further questions, my email is there, Sam's email was there, and we'll both be happy to answer any questions that you have on the topic to the best of our ability.